Look, lady, I don't know who you are, and frankly, I don't care. This access point is for authorized personnel only. Now get your dusty jumpsuit out of my corridor before I have you thrown in the brig. The crowd of junior officers and enlisted ratings snickered, a wave of nervous amusement that rippled down the cold, sterile passageway of the orbital dry dock. Lieutenant Commander Kalen Vance stood with his arms crossed, a perfect monolith of polished insignia and crisp, starched whites, his frame filling the bulkhead entrance to the engineering control nexus of the fleet's newest supercarrier, the FNS Vigilance. He looked down his perfectly sculpted nose at the woman before him. She was small, perhaps in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple, functional bun. Her hands were stained with what looked like hydraulic fluid, and her gray utility jumpsuit was worn at the knees and elbows, the fabric softened by 1,000 cycles in the ship's laundry. She carried no data slate, no officer's sidearm, no mark of rank or privilege. To Vance, she was just another nameless maintenance worker, another piece of the vast, anonymous machinery that kept the fleet running, and she was in his way. But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't even meet his gaze, her eyes instead fixed on a small, almost invisible hairline fracture in the plasteel wall beside his head. Her silence was not the silence of fear or intimidation. It was something else entirely, something heavy and ancient, like the quiet of deep space between stars. But when the ship's commanding officer, Captain Thorne, saw her stance from the far end of the corridor, the way her weight was perfectly centered, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing impossibly calm amidst the casual cruelty, a cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He had seen that posture before, in places where legends were born and lesser men died. If you believe that true authority is earned in silence and not shouted in corridors, type competence below. The woman, whose name nobody had bothered to ask, simply held up a small, unassuming tool, a custom-forged resonance key, its handle wrapped in worn leather. It looked like a relic from a forgotten age, completely out of place against the shimmering holographic interfaces and sterile chrome of the Vigilance. Vance scoffed, a puff of derisive air. "What are you going to do with that, Grandma? Tune the comms array? I've given you a lawful order." Move, he took a step forward, his hand coming up not in a gesture of violence, but of dismissal, of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He placed his palm flat against her shoulder and shoved her back, not hard, but with the casual force one might use to move a piece of furniture. She stumbled a single step, her worn boot scraping against the deck plating, before her balance corrected itself with an unnatural swiftness. She was as unyielding as the titanium frame of the ship around them. Her eyes, for the first time, lifted to meet his. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky over a frozen sea, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, Vance felt as though he were being analyzed not by a person, but by a diagnostic system of incomprehensible power. He saw in them no anger, no fear, no humiliation. He saw only data being processed, variables being weighed, and a conclusion being reached. The quiet laughter from the onlookers died in their throats, replaced by a tense, uncertain silence. They had come to see a low-level crewman get put in her place by the hotshot security chief. They had not expected this unnerving, profound stillness. The very air in the corridor seemed to grow thicker, heavier, charged with an unspoken energy. The ambient hum of the ship's life support systems, the distant clang of machinery, all of it faded into a dull background thrum against the deafening quiet emanating from this one small, unassuming woman. Her continued silence was a far more potent rebuttal than any shouted retort could ever be. It was a mirror, and in it, Vance's blustering arrogance was reflected back at him, suddenly looking cheap, brittle, and profoundly foolish. He had expected her to shrink, to stammer an apology, to scurry away. Instead, she stood her ground, a rock against which his wave of self-importance had just crashed and broken. He felt a flush of anger, the kind that only comes from deep-seated insecurity being unexpectedly exposed. He was about to speak again, to escalate, to reassert the dominance he felt slipping from his grasp, when a new sound cut through the tension. It was not a loud sound, but it was the most feared sound on any starship, A single, high-pitched, warbling alarm tone from deep within the engineering nexus he was so proudly guarding. It was a sound that meant something somewhere had gone catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for irony. The single alarm tone was joined by another, then a third, a discordant chorus of electronic panic that echoed off the metal walls. A crimson light began to pulse, washing the corridor in waves of urgent red. On the bulkhead monitor behind Vance, a schematic of the ship's primary fusion core flashed up, a cascade of error codes scrolling down the screen so fast they blurred into a single waterfall of gibberish. Shouts erupted from within the control room. Core containment field is fluctuating. We have a plasma leak in the primary conduit, another voice yelled, laced with terror. Temperature is spiking past redline. We're 30 seconds from an emergency shutdown. Maybe less. The junior officers who had been smirking moments before were now pale, their eyes wide with the primal fear of men trapped in a metal box miles from anywhere, a box that was about to become their tomb. Vance spun around, his own arrogance instantly incinerated by the heat of genuine crisis. He was a security officer. He knew how to handle borders, repel pirates, and enforce discipline. A C-class reactor breach was so far beyond his understanding it might as well have been arcane magic. He was useless, a decorative guard standing at the gates of hell. He and his men could only stare, frozen, at the unfolding disaster. The technicians inside the Nexus were screaming conflicting orders, their formal procedures dissolving into raw panic. But through the chaos, one thing remained constant: the woman. She had not moved. The pulsing red lights reflected in her calm, winter-blue eyes. Her head was cocked slightly, as if she were listening not to the panicked shouts, but to the deep, groaning sounds of the ship itself, to the tortured hum of a machine tearing itself apart. Her focus was absolute. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly at odds with the frantic energy around her, she took a step forward. Vance, acting on pure instinct, moved to block her again. "You can't go in there." He started, but the words died on his lips. She didn't even look at him. She simply sidestepped his clumsy attempt to bar her way, moving with an economy of motion that was less a dodge and more a demonstration that he was not, and had never been, a relevant obstacle. She walked past the threshold into the heart of the chaos, the small, strange tool held loosely in her right hand. The technicians, seeing her worn jumpsuit, paid her no mind, continuing their desperate, failing dance with their consoles. She moved past them, her gaze sweeping across the holographic displays, her mind absorbing the torrent of failure state data with an impossible speed. She was not reading it. She was inhaling it. Her path was not random. She moved with unnerving purpose toward a secondary maintenance panel, a small, forgotten plate low on the wall that no one ever used, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. It was a manual override junction for the plasma conduits, a piece of legacy hardware considered obsolete, a relic designed for a type of emergency modern systems were supposed to have made impossible. Kneeling down, she ignored the frantic shouts and the blaring alarms. Her world had shrunk to the surface of this small metal plate. With her free hand, she wiped the dust away, her fingers tracing the faint outline of the access seam. The technicians were now screaming about a full-scale core ejection, a last-ditch maneuver that would save the dry dock, but turn the multi-trillion-credit vigilance into a dead, radioactive hulk. They had given up. They were preparing for the end. But the woman was just beginning. She placed the tip of her strange, custom-forged resonance key into a nearly invisible slot on the panel. There was no forceful push, no desperate wrenching. She simply closed her eyes, and for a long moment, the only movement was the slow, steady rise and fall of her shoulders. Her fingers made a series of microscopic adjustments to the tool, turning it by fractions of a degree, guided by a sense of touch that seemed to extend through the metal, down the fiber optic cabling, and into the very heart of the failing reactor. Vance watched, mesmerized from the doorway. He saw her knuckles whiten slightly. He heard a series of soft, rhythmic clicks from the tool, almost musical in their precision. It was the sound of a master locksmith picking an impossible lock. She was not repairing the system. She was communing with it, speaking to the machine in its own native, physical language. The air in the room crackled with static discharge. The lights flickered violently. On the main screen, the temperature gauge, which had been screaming past its absolute limit, suddenly froze. It held for a heart-stopping second, then another. The frantic scrolling of error code slowed, then stopped. A single line of text appeared in stark, simple green. Manual override engaged. Plasma flow rerouted. Containment field stabilizing. A collective, ragged gasp went through the room. One by one, the wailing alarms fell silent. The crimson emergency lights gave way to the steady, clean white of normal operations. The temperature gauge began to creep back down, moving from the deep red of catastrophe back into the amber of caution, and then, finally, into the reassuring green of stability. The entire event, from the moment she knelt down to the moment the last alarm silenced itself, had taken less than 15 seconds. A deafening silence fell over the engineering nexus. It was a silence far more profound than the one in the corridor. It was the silence of averted annihilation. It was the silence of utter, stupefied disbelief. The technicians slowly turned from their consoles, their faces masks of sweat-streaked shock and awe, and stared at the small, older woman in the dusty jumpsuit who was now calmly getting to her feet, wiping the resonance key on her pant leg before tucking it back into a hidden pocket. She hadn't broken a sweat. Her breathing was as even and calm as it had been when Vance had shoved her against the wall. She had just single-handedly saved the most advanced warship in human history from certain destruction, and she looked as though she had just been watering her plants. Vance felt the deck plating sway beneath his feet, his entire perception of the world tilting on its axis. The universe he had understood, a universe of rank, of appearance, of loud authority, had just been proven to be a fragile, laughable illusion. His mind struggled to reconcile the image of the grandma he had insulted with the reality of the savant who had just performed a miracle of engineering. He could only utter two words, a weak, pathetic whisper that was swallowed by the immense, reverent quiet. No way. Captain Marcus Thorne arrived on the scene like a storm front, his face a thunderous mask of controlled fury. He wasn't running, but he moved with a speed and purpose that made the air part before him. His eyes, the color of hard steel, swept over the scene in a single, all-encompassing glance. The terrified but safe technicians, the now stable reactor schematics glowing green on the main screen, the arrogant and now utterly shattered form of Lieutenant Commander Vance, and finally, the quiet woman in the maintenance jumpsuit who was now inspecting the hairline fracture in the wall as if the preceding events had been a minor distraction. Thorne didn't speak to the technicians. He didn't speak to Vance. He walked directly to the woman. He stopped a respectful 3 paces from her, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not recognize her face, but he recognized the aura around her. It was an aura of absolute, unshakable competence, a quality he had encountered only a handful of times in his 30-year career, and always in the presence of legends. "Report," he said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the residual shock in the room. His command was directed at her, an implicit acknowledgement that she, and she alone, was the ranking authority in this space. The woman finally turned her head from the wall. She looked at Thorne, her gaze level and direct. "Subharmonic resonance in the conduit casing," she said, her voice quiet but clear, each word precise and stripped of any extraneous detail. A manufacturing flaw. The standard diagnostic software wouldn't detect it until the core was brought to 70% power. The vibrations caused a microfracture, which compromised the containment field. I rerouted the plasma flow through the auxiliary conduits and created a counter-frequency in the magnetic field to dampen the resonance. She gestured vaguely at the panel she had used. "The manual system is more robust." It worked. Her explanation was simple, technical, and utterly devoid of ego. She spoke of saving a 10 billion credit warship with the same tone one might use to describe fixing a leaky faucet. Thorne listened, his expression unchanging, but a flicker of something, a memory, a connection, sparked deep in his eyes. He had read a technical paper on subharmonic resonance in fusion conduits years ago, a revolutionary piece of theory that had redesigned the safety protocols for the entire fleet. The paper had been dense, brilliant, and authored by a name he had never forgotten. He turned to the nearest still-functioning console, his movements crisp and efficient. Computer, access fleet personnel file. Authorization Thorn, Marcus, Captain, serial number 7-3-4. Delta, the computer chirped in acknowledgement. Search by name. ROSDOVA. First name, EVA. The name hung in the air, electric. A few of the older technicians in the room audibly gasped. The name was a myth, a ghost in the machine of the fleet, the reclusive genius who had designed the power systems for every major warship built in the last 4 decades. But she was supposed to be a recluse, a shadowy figure who worked from a private research station on Luna, not someone who walked the corridors in a grease-stained jumpsuit. The computer chimed, and a file appeared on the screen. It was sparse, heavily redacted, most of its contents classified far above even a captain's clearance. But the parts that were visible were enough. The screen glowed with the stark, blocky text of a top-tier service record. It was a litany of impossible achievements, a career forged in the heart of the fleet's most complex and dangerous technological challenges. Name, Rostova. EVA rank. Fleet Admiral. The words seemed to burn on the screen, each letter a brand of fire on Kalen Vance's soul. Fleet Admiral. The highest attainable rank in the Navy, a position held by only 4 individuals in the entire fleet command structure. It was a rank so elevated, so far removed from the day-to-day life of a junior officer like Vance, that its holder was more of an abstract concept than a person. He had shoved a fleet admiral. He had insulted a fleet admiral. He had called a living legend grandma and ordered her to move. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of horror. He felt a profound, system-crushing shame so intense it was physically painful, as if his own skeleton were trying to collapse under the weight of his stupidity. The narrator's voice in his mind, the one that had always told him he was smarter, better, and more important than everyone else, was now just a screaming, silent void. The list on the screen continued, each line another hammer blow to his shattered ego. Current posting. Chief of Naval Engineering, Special Projects Division, notable design credits. Mark IV Fusion Core, Yorktown class. Cascade Shielding System, all active carriers. Rostova Equation, 4 subspace field stabilization medals. Fleet Star of Valor for actions during the Orion emergency. Medal of Technological Supremacy, with 3 clusters. Legion of Merit. The last line was the most damning. Special Attachment, F&S Vigilance. Personal oversight of power core activation. Classification, eyes only. She wasn't just visiting. This was her ship. She had designed the very heart that had almost failed, and she was the only person in the universe who knew how to save it. She had been here, in her unassuming disguise, to watch her creation come to life, to feel its pulse, to ensure the theories she had written on a data slate translated perfectly into humming, living reality. Captain Thorne stared at the screen for a long, silent moment. Then he straightened his back, his posture becoming so rigid it seemed carved from stone. He pivoted on his heel with the sharp precision of a parade ground maneuver. He faced the woman, who was watching him with that same unnerving, analytical calm. He did not speak. Instead, he raised his right hand to his brow, his fingers perfectly straight, his thumb tucked in. It was not a casual salute. It was the formal, high-protocol salute reserved for the highest echelons of command, a gesture of profound, unconditional respect and submission to authority. The sharp snap of his hand, meeting his brow, echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. Admiral Rostova, ma'am. Thorne's voice was gravelly with emotion, with the sheer, unadulterated respect of a professional for a master. My apologies for the lax security on your deck. Every single person in the room, technicians, security guards, officers, seemed to move as one. Following Thorne's lead, they all snapped to attention, their backs ramrod straight, their eyes fixed forward. A forest of salutes bloomed in the engineering nexus. The only person not at attention was Lieutenant Commander Kalen Vance. He stood frozen, his arms limp at his sides, his mouth slightly agape. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, publicly exposed as a fool and a bully in front of his subordinates, his commanding officer, and a figure of galactic importance. The respect being shown to her was a direct measure of the disrespect he had offered. He had pushed her against a wall, and now, that same wall felt like it was closing in to crush him. The story of what happened in Engineering Section 7 Alpha aboard the FNS Vigilance spread through the orbital dry dock with the speed of a priority subspace transmission. It wasn't an official report. It was something far more potent. It was a legend. It traveled through hushed conversations in the mess halls, in encrypted messages between crew members, in the knowing glances exchanged by seasoned non-commissioned officers. It became the story of the Admiral in the gray jumpsuit. It was told to new recruits as a cautionary tale, a lesson in humility served straight from the command level. The corridor where the confrontation had occurred was unofficially nicknamed Vance's Wall, or, more charitably, the Rostova Line, a symbolic boundary between arrogance and competence. The legend wasn't about the technical details of the near disaster. Few understood the physics of subharmonic resonance. It was about the human element. It was about the hotshot security chief who judged a book by its worn, grease-stained cover and the quiet, unassuming master who had written the entire library. Lieutenant Commander Vance was not formally disciplined, at least not in a way that would ever appear on his record. Admiral Rostova had specifically forbidden it. To her, a public reprimand was a crude instrument, as clumsy and ineffective as Vance's initial assessment of her. True lessons, she knew, were not imposed. They were integrated. His punishment was far more subtle and infinitely more effective. It was the memory of the event itself, a memory that now replayed in his mind on an endless loop. It was the sea of salutes that had not included him. It was the look of pity mixed with contempt in the eyes of his own men. It was the crushing, suffocating knowledge of his own monumental foolishness. Captain Thorne had summoned him to his ready room a few hours after the incident. Vance had stood at attention, braced for the career-ending tirade he so richly deserved. But Thorne had not yelled. He had simply sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers, and looked at Vance with a profound sense of disappointment. "Respect, Commander," Thorne had said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a battleship. "Is not about the insignia on a collar. It's about the knowledge in a mind and the character in a soul. You are trained to identify threats, but you failed to identify greatness. Your eyes saw a janitor, when your instincts should have felt a master. Your assumptions nearly cost us this ship. Reevaluate your diagnostic criteria." That was all. He was dismissed. The quiet words were a more severe indictment than any court-martial could ever be. Vance began to change. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He started speaking less and listening more. He was seen in the ship's library, studying schematics, reading technical manuals on subjects far outside his security specialization. He started talking to the enlisted maintenance crews, asking them about their work, learning their names, listening to their insights. He learned that the man who recalibrates the nutritional paste dispensers was a master of microservos, and the woman who laundered the uniforms had an encyclopedic knowledge of chemical solvents. He began to see the ship not as a hierarchy of ranks, but as a complex ecosystem of skills where every individual, no matter their station, possessed a unique and vital expertise. He was learning to see the admirals hidden in gray jumpsuits all around him. The legend of that day did more than just humble one arrogant officer. It began to subtly reshape the culture of the entire fleet. The story became a touchstone, a piece of modern folklore that illustrated a core, often forgotten, tenet of their service. The Rostova principle began to appear in leadership seminars at the Naval Academy. It was simple. Competence is quiet, and assumptions are the enemy of readiness. It taught new officers to look past the surface, to value the grizzled master chief with oil under his fingernails as much as the decorated captain with a chest full of ribbons. It emphasized that a true leader's strength was not in the volume of their commands, but in the depth of their perception. Kalen Vance, against all odds, did not see his career end. In fact, in the years that followed, he thrived. His newfound humility, forged in the fires of public shame, became his greatest asset. It made him a better leader, more empathetic, more observant, and infinitely wiser. Commanders who had once dismissed him as a preening popinjay now sought his counsel. He became known for his calm demeanor under pressure and for his almost preternatural ability to identify and empower the right person for any given task, regardless of their rank or role. He never saw Admiral Rostova in person again. She had left the Vigilance as quietly as she had arrived, disappearing back into the classified world of research and development from which she had emerged. But her presence remained. For Vance, she was a constant, invisible mentor. Before making any important decision, he would ask himself a simple question. What would she see here? It forced him to strip away his biases, to ignore the superficial, and to focus only on the essential truth of the situation. The physical artifact of the event, the small, dusty maintenance panel in Engineering Section 7 Alpha, was encased in a clear polymer frame by order of Captain Thorne. Next to it, a small brass plaque was mounted on the bulkhead. It did not recount the full story. It didn't need to. It contained only a date, a ship's name, and a single, powerful quote attributed to Fleet Admiral Eva Rostova from one of her early theoretical papers. The signal is always there. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. It became a point of pilgrimage for young engineers and ambitious officers, a small shrine to the virtue of silent, demonstrated excellence. They would stand before it, touching the cool polymer, hoping to absorb a fraction of the wisdom it represented. The legend had become institutional memory, a permanent part of the fleet's identity. The story of the Admiral in the gray jumpsuit was no longer just a story. It was a standard, a benchmark against which all officers were measured. It was a constant reminder that the most powerful weapon in the fleet was not a torpedo or a laser cannon, but the quiet competence of a master at their craft. And for Kalen Vance, who had once been the villain of the story, it became his redemption. He had been the catalyst, the fool whose arrogance had created the conditions for a legend to be born. In his failure, the entire fleet had found a new definition of success. He had been humbled so that thousands of others could learn to be humble. It was a harsh lesson, but a necessary one, and in the end, it had saved more than just a ship. It had saved the soul of the fleet. A decade passed. The FNS Vigilance was now the celebrated flagship of the fleet, a symbol of power and technological grace, its reactor core having performed flawlessly on 100 campaigns. Captain Thorne had been promoted to Commodore, now commanding his own battle group from the Vigilance's bridge. And Kalen Vance, now a full captain himself, stood before a class of fresh-faced ensigns at the Naval Academy. He was leaner, his face etched with the lines of experience and genuine wisdom. The brittle arrogance of his youth had been replaced by a deep, resonant calm. He stood before a holographic display showing a picture of a dusty maintenance panel next to a simple brass plaque. He was delivering the final lecture in their leadership and ethics course, a lecture that had become famously known as the Rostova Principle. He did not rely on notes. He spoke from the heart, his voice steady and clear. Your greatest enemy will not be the pirates in the asteroid belts or the rival factions on the frontier, he told the young officers, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. Your greatest enemy will be your own assumptions. It will be the voice in your head that tells you that you know better, that you are more important, that you can judge a person's worth by the uniform they wear or the title they hold. He recounted the story of that day on the Vigilance. He did not spare himself. He told them his name. He told them of his arrogance, of his dismissive words, of the shove. He painted a vivid, unflinching portrait of his own failure. The ensigns listened in rapt silence, their youthful confidence tempered by the raw honesty of his confession. I looked at one of the founding geniuses of our age, Vance continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. A woman who could calculate stellar drift in her head and redesign a fusion core on a cocktail napkin, and all I saw was a janitor. My assumption of superiority blinded me to the reality of her greatness. That blindness, that arrogance, nearly vaporized 1,000 souls and the most powerful ship ever built. He let the weight of that statement settle in the room. The lesson of that day was not that you should be afraid of insulting a secret admiral. The lesson is that everyone around you is a secret admiral in their own domain. The cook who perfects the nutrient balance in the mess hall, the technician who can diagnose an engine flaw by the pitch of its hum, the yeoman who organizes data with perfect, intuitive clarity. They are all masters. They are all quiet professionals. Your job, as leaders, is not to command them. It is to see them. It is to create an environment where their competence has the space to reveal itself. Your authority is not a weapon to be wielded. It is a lens to be focused, to find the brilliance hidden in plain sight. He had given this lecture dozens of times, but the memory remained as sharp and as humbling as ever. It was his penance and his purpose. He had turned the worst moment of his life into its most defining lesson, a gift he now passed on to every new generation of officers, ensuring the legacy of that day would never fade. The true legacy of Eva Rostova wasn't in the ships she designed or the equations she solved. Her true legacy was in the quiet, profound cultural shift she had accidentally triggered. It was in the thousands of interactions that now happened every day across the fleet. A young lieutenant asking a veteran mechanic for their opinion, a squadron leader listening intently to the concerns of their lowest-ranked deckhand, a culture of mutual respect built not on the rigid hierarchy of rank, but on the fluid, more powerful hierarchy of skill. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in monuments of steel or plaques of brass. It's what continues forward in the actions and beliefs of others. It's a lesson learned, a perspective shifted, a seed of wisdom planted that grows into a forest of better leaders. Admiral Rostova remained a ghost, a myth. She never took public credit for what she did. She never attended the ceremonies or accepted the new commendations that were offered. To her, the event was not a moment of personal vindication. It was simply a problem that needed solving. The reactor was unstable, so she stabilized it. The arrogance of a young officer was a flaw in the system, and her very presence had, inadvertently, corrected it. She was, and always would be, an engineer. She fixed things, and on that day, she had fixed more than just a warship. She had repaired a fundamental flaw in the culture of the institution she served. Somewhere, in a quiet, sterile laboratory orbiting a distant moon, an older woman in a simple gray jumpsuit was likely hunched over a new holographic schematic, her mind wrestling with the next generation of challenges, her hands stained with the ink of creation. She didn't need statues or stories. Her reward was the silent, perfect hum of a well-made machine, and the knowledge that the fleet, the vast and complex machine she had dedicated her life to, was running just a little bit better, a little bit wiser, because of a single quiet moment in a forgotten corridor. The universe is full of noise, of shouted commands and boastful proclamations, but progress, true and lasting progress, is always built in the quiet, in the steady, methodical application of competence, in the silent triumph of action over words. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where a person's character defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.